Hello again for everyone who's joining. We are just waiting for people to join and we'll start in a couple of minutes. Thank you again. I see we are 2 minutes past the hour, and I would like to welcome you again to FTI Consulting webinar on the European election outcomes. Thank you very much for joining us. We are here today to spend an hour to discuss the outcome of the election and outline a little bit what impact it may have on the EU itself and the countries interacting with the EU, but also the businesses that have presence here. We have a very broad church with us online today. We have friends and clients from near and far, so we'll try to cover the most ground we can. But should you have any questions, we do have a Q&A session at the end, so please do not hesitate to send us some questions. We know that undoubtedly quite a bit of it will change in the next weeks and months, but FTI Consulting will definitely be staying up to date as much as we can, so reach out in the future. In the meantime, I would like to present our experts with us today who will be helping us to dive deep into this topic. We have Hans Hack, the Senior Managing Director, ahead of Brussels office at FTI Consulting. We also have Thea Utoft, who is a Senior Managing Director as well, and EMEA Financial Services Public Affairs Lead at FTI Consulting. We have Dafni Kachrila Skouteli, who's a Director at FTI, who will help us understand the initial outcomes and highlight the trends. And we have myself, Marija Ivoninaite, a Director at FTI, who will help you guide you through this discussion. Before we kick off, we just have a couple of notes on housekeeping. This is obviously a webinar where we have participants off camera and on mute, but we are very happy to take your questions during the event and during the Q&A session, where you can put those into the Q&A box just on the right-hand side of your screen. Please write your questions and mention your name. Finally, the session will be recorded for a later peruse. But without further ado, I would like to pass on to my colleague Dafni, who will kick us off with a presentation of the results and some initial trends.
Thank you, Marija, and hi, everyone. Welcome on my side, too. So, yes, just a quick snapshot of the official results for anyone who hasn't checked them today or so far in general. The center-right, the European People's Party, got 26% of the parliament seats, which means that it remains in this term to the largest political group and power, and even increased its size and currently holds 189 seats. Then we have the center-left Social Democrats, who remain the largest political group with 135 seats, followed by the Liberals, Renew Europe, which actually decreased in size, but still manages to keep the third position for now. The two right and far-right groups also made quite substantial gains. Together, actually, they make almost 20% of the new parliament seats. The Greens took the biggest hit and actually lost many of their seats. So if we are to summarize these results so far, we can see that the center groups still hold their ground. They still run the show as they did in the past years and maintain a coalition. Of course, this is slightly weakened, and as they may have around 41 seats above the majority threshold to govern. From these results, if there are 5 things to remember, we wanted to give you the first point, which is that the center is actually likely to hold, but will still need to hang on because the result is not final yet. There are currently around 50 seats from new political parties that have not yet been affiliated to their European groups. So from this process, we expect the right and the far right to grow and receive more seats. And this would mean that the Liberals could actually fall from the third position to the fourth position. So depending on the final formation of the parliament, it might not be possible for the center coalition to govern comfortably. And this means that the European People's Party, the largest group, will need to strike some bargains to partner with groups either to its right, which means that there could be some bargains and migration guarantees, or with the Greens, so with some climate guarantees. The second point to remember is that there is expected continuity on the political agenda to some extent, because of course the rise of the right will inevitably mean that there might be some more focus on migration, a made in Europe approach, strategic autonomy, and less focus on the green agenda. A third point to remember is that we expect continuity on the top job too. Current Commission President von der Leyen is in a good position to keep her post. However, this cannot be certain until the last minute. And the fifth point, and perhaps the most important observation coming out from this election, is that some national governments were substantially impacted by the EU level results, which means that we see now more some of the most powerful leaders be weakened. For example, in France, the success of the far-right party led by President Macron, the far-right party success led President Macron to call for snap election. And in Germany, Chancellor Scholz also suffered a major defeat, and his government might not last for too long. So we see the Franco-German influence perhaps a bit more limited. And inversely, we see some other major member states like Italy and the right Premier Meloni being called as the king's makers coming forward because of the success of the results of the national parties. So in terms of next steps, the important game starts now, actually, because the political horse trading over the EU's top job position will begin for real now. We already see an early consensus over top jobs, and the next two informal and formal EU leaders meetings are very crucial on June 17 and June 27 and 28, where we might already see EU leaders agreeing on the top job, at least for the Commission President. And then we will go to the Parliament plenary either in 16 July or 16 September, where this name is likely to be confirmed. But overall, even like in the next months until November, December, it's going to be a very busy period for the confirmation of all names, all other top jobs, and of course the commissioners as well. So with this quick high-level intro, I wanted to pass over to Marija to moderate the remaining discussion.
Thanks so much, Dafni. That has been very helpful, and will definitely illuminate quite a bit of the discussion that we're going to have now for the next half hour or so. So Dafni has already highlighted a couple of topics that we will touch upon now, and today we want to take these conversations even further and talk about some of the topics that have been at the tip of everyone's tongue, a little bit about security, green and digital transition, touch about migration, strategic autonomy, and all of the buzzwords that we love in the bubble and outside of it. So again, thanks Hans, thanks Thea for joining us today. I'd love to kick us off with my personal favorite, the Green Deal. So this has been a flagship priority for the Commission, von der Leyen's flagship policy, and one of the key topics that shape the conversations. Where are we sitting now today? I'm curious to see what your views are on the Green Deal and the climate policies going forward. What do you think the election means for it? What do you think also, what does it mean for the other leading policies that shape this conversation? Like I mentioned, the strategic autonomy, the focus on healthcare that we had since post-COVID. Do you think these topics are going to carry forward to the next 5 years?
So it's a good question, Marija, and welcome everybody. It's nice to be here. I think the first caveat that I should give is that we don't know exactly yet, right? Some of the numbers are still shaking out, as Dafni very eloquently explained. The EU is not ruled by the European Parliament like a national parliament would rule a national country or set priorities, because you have three bodies that make decisions: the Commission, the Member States, and the Parliament. But that said, I think it's clear that the Green Deal will have fewer proponents than in the previous mandate. In this mandate, we actually already saw that before the elections with positioning of political parties and some of the protests of, for example, the farmers here in Brussels that led to weakening of some of those rules. So I think you can safely assume that with the parliamentary election outcome, with a shift of the large part to the right and a decrease of the Greens, notably, and the national impact of more nationalist populist parties winning in the national elections, especially in Germany and France, but also countries like the Netherlands, I think it's safe to assume that there's not going to be as much push or priority given to the Green Deal as we've seen in the current mandate. Does that mean that I think there will be a wholesale destruction of the Green Deal or rollback of all of the rules? I would not expect so, because I think there is widespread understanding and acceptance that these measures are necessary. I think there's two things that we could expect. One is that there's not going to be a lot of other very ambitious rules or legislation of targets coming out very quickly, I would imagine, because a large majority of the new MEPs will be skeptical about that. And the second effect that I think that we can see is that in the rollout of the existing legislation, is legislation that has been agreed already now, we might see some timelines being expanded, some definitions being narrowed. So the impact of that, people trying to lessen the impact of the rules that have actually been agreed. One notable fight that we can expect, because they've been extremely vocal about it, is from the EPP group saying that the ban on the combustion engine should be reviewed or withdrawn. And I think that there's going to be a push from the EPP. But here I would come back to some of the deal making that needs to happen. Dafni already mentioned that von der Leyen will need to find an agreement by a majority, 50% plus one of the European Parliament, to get reinstalled as a Commission President. She needs to be nominated by the member states, heads of state first of all. And in that, I would imagine that the S&D, which is going to play a key role in that, would push heavily on maintaining the Green Deal and defending it as much as possible. So I think the EPP cannot really push forward its own positioning in that the way they want to. There have to be agreements made. I think that no withdrawal of the legislation as such, but some elements might be adjusted and timelines might be extended or targets might be interpreted a bit differently. I think that the level of prioritization going down could also mean that you will not see an executive vice president that pushes for the Green Deal like it was last time, is from Timmermans for a long time and then later taken over by others. I think that might be part of the reorganization of the Commission with priorities rather than other areas where a majority would want to see progress.
Thanks so much, Hans. Just one piece from me. Do you think, we were talking a little bit about the environmental regulations as well, but do you think any of those likely to subdue, likely to take back and affect any sort of third country trade between the EU? Do you think we could see and expect any lessening of it, or do you think that's still going to carry a certain dimension there?
That is a very interesting discussion. I think trade, and we'll probably touch on that later in the discussion as well, trade wasn't particularly popular in the previous mandate and in the European Parliament, but also in certain national parliaments. I think it's going to be even more complicated for the EU to conclude trade deals with the new composition of the European Parliament and some of the positioning of member states. And if there will be trade, and I think the environmental impact part will become still part of trade deals because of the competitiveness dimension to the EU in that sense. So we'll probably come back to both of those elements in a bit.
Indeed. I think that's exactly a really good segue to that trade and economics side of things. And here, I think many of us are staying up to date, awaiting for Mario Draghi's report on the future of Europe, which is imminent. And the timing is indeed not coincidental. I think here, a little bit of what Hans already touched upon, we would love to hear more from you guys. What do you think are the key drivers of the European economy? And the single market and the capital markets union, and where do you think the EU is headed? Thea, perhaps you have some thoughts on the competition side of things.
Well, I think it's interesting when we look at also the results that Dafni presented, is that to a certain extent we've seen this trend going back into the more kind of conservative, secure mandates around the EPP is something that we're seeing that trend repeats itself when we have these situations where what is Europe and what is Europe doing on the global scene. To a certain extent, I think what we're going to see is that we're going to see a return back to the, I want to say, the original virtues of Europe. It's the single market, it's the strengthening of the single market, and it is a strategic priority about making sure that we're to a certain extent, some people talk about deepening the project or completing the project. So having a single market that is even deeper, even stronger, that goes both on the competitiveness front. So it means making sure that Europe is strong from within, self-reliant. From a trade perspective, you can kind of make the link to secure supply chains. We've seen that with different kind of crises over the last 5 years. That is a topic that has been emerging and will not go away for the next 5 years. We know there are shifting tectonic plates that, from the political perspective, necessitates that Europe kind of reinvigorates and strengthens its own identity. And we know that it's a priority for the leaders, the heads of state, that they want to have a prosperous and competitive Europe. So we've got the informal European Council coming up next week. I think we're all expecting to see something quite substantive from Draghi timing into that meeting. It is an informal meeting, so of course there's a lot of things that will be happening in a much more confidential and private setting amongst the leaders. So not only do they need to start discussing about what are the distribution of the top jobs, they also need to start looking to the ideas that came out in the Draghi, the letter report about the capital markets union. So for instance, what are we going to do about our economic security, our economic strength? How are we going to foster that innovation? But also more importantly, what are we doing about systemic insecurities? In the old days, well, I'm financial services, right? So we used to talk about shadow banking. Now we talk about non-bank financial intermediation. But that whole kind of looking at it from a risk perspective for the economy. So economic security, economic strength, and just making sure that we don't build a fort Europe, but we bolster the strength of Europe. And that, to me, is also something that is very visible in how the EPP remains a strong party, and we see that coalition is still a strong and center driver in the European Parliament. I'm very much looking forward to next week myself, because I think we'll see a lot of interesting signals on how that economic discussion is going to come. A lot of these conversations have already been started in the Council, in the Commission. Once we start seeing some of these signals come out of the Parliament, I think we'll start to see a really exciting agenda for the next 5 years.
Thanks very much, Thea. And Hans, of course, you already touched a little bit on trade and then the previous question, but is there anything you'd like to add on that dimension of trade protectionism, potentially tariff influence? Is there anything there that we can already pick up on of the direction of travel for the next 5 years?
I think so, and this might not, and I think it's been said before, it might not come from the Parliament election as such, but more from the member states' developments. I think you've seen in the last couple of years that de-risking towards China has become an important factor. We've seen traditionally really free trade nations like the Netherlands and Sweden actually become more open to, looking closely at what type of investments are coming in and what the competitive position of Europe is vis-a-vis the others. So there's more skepticism of free trade. Certainly with regard to agriculture, that's the case. And I really imagine that a treaty like Mercosur, which has been out there for a long time and which has not been concluded because there was strong pushback also by France, but also other countries. I just have a hard time imagining how the EU in the new composition with this parliament, but also with some national governments, are going to be more able to conclude trade agreements. So I think there is going to be more. There are more barriers going to be put up to trade than before, because even in the current mandate, where there was more willingness to go there, it was very difficult to conclude trade agreements. So it has certainly not gotten easier. It's the best and safest way to describe that.
Thanks so much. Next, I think we could dive into something that has been really at the top of our tongues and the focus of the conversations about the bubble. Let's dive into geopolitics. Something a little bit more about security and common defense spending were not necessarily my 2019 bingo topics. However, here they are today, shaping most of the conversations I have at work and outside of work. Today, I'd love to hear more from you. What do you think, how do you think these challenges develop in the future? Do you think them coming into so deep into the conversations that we're having, almost regardless of the industry that we're covering, has it changed the nature of the European project? Hans, yes. Perhaps, yeah?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it bears remembering that when Ursula von der Leyen entered, she was going to have a geopolitical commission, and I think in a way that commission got more than it's bargained for with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which really put it on the forefront. So the previous commission had already needed to be more focused on geopolitics, and I think right now that is really a key topic. Defense has always divided the European Union. A lot of member states feel that is more NATO's role rather than the European Union's role. A lot of European countries have been lambasted by President Trump for not spending their 2% of GDP on defense, which was agreed within the NATO framework. There's a rapid increase of defense spending across Europe. Von der Leyen has already indicated that her plan would be, if she would become president of the European Commission again, that there would be much more focus on defense and potentially a commissioner for defense. Potentially in the European Parliament, there would be a specific subcommittee or even full committee on defense. Little used instrument like the European Peace Facility have already been, in the context of the Ukraine war and support from Europe to Ukraine, have already been beefed up a lot. There's even talk by some of the frugal nations like Denmark, and I'll let Thea cover Denmark because she's far more knowledgeable about that. But common debt towards defense for supporting Ukraine was actually, by a traditionally frugal nation, openly contemplated, like, would it make sense to have joint borrowing in the EU to provide more support to Ukraine? So there's a lot of emphasis on that, and I think security as such, and physical security, but maybe also cyber security will really be a key priority for this Parliament and this European Commission. And I think even with more nationalist governments in certain places and a larger group of nationalist parties also in the European Parliament, I think that sense is a pretty widely shared sense that Europe needs to be stronger on defense and security on its own. And I think we'll probably touch on the US a bit later as well, but the cloud of a potential re-election of President Trump adds to that sentiment, because we cannot be sure that the US would come to the defense of Europe with a Trump presidency. And that's also that sentiment that Europe does need to do a lot more in defense. And you've seen that in many countries that defense spending is really ramped up. And common procurement or joint joint action on that within the EU makes perfect sense. Even if a European army, which is sometimes used as a bit of a scary proposition in certain countries, I don't think a European army as such is going to happen. And I think NATO is going to remain incredibly relevant and the core anchor of security. But joining forces to strengthen the European defense capability is definitely a key priority in the next 5 years.
Just a follow-up question for me as well. Do you think that those conversations and bringing those conversations closer to the core of the EU workings as it is now, do you think it has any impact on the other discussions that we've been having a little bit earlier about strategic autonomy and Europe's global influence? Do you think overall foreign policy priorities have changed significantly because of this, or perhaps irrespective of this? And do you think the next elected parliament may have any influence of that direction of travel?
I think there's more understanding that if you don't also have a strong defense coordination within the EU, the economic power alone, which the EU has sort of leaned on most so far, right? The internal market is the powerful force for the EU, because through economic power and 500 million relatively affluent consumers, you can actually achieve a lot in trade agreements and in geopolitics. I think the current realization is that that needs to be backed up by also a pretty solid defense capability within Europe. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to come fully under the umbrella of the EU. Don't think that that will happen, but there is a clear understanding, and also that Europe needs to be able to produce more materials for defending, because we can't even get enough shells over to Ukraine, which we promised, because the production capacity is just not there. And there is general, I think, consensus that more needs to happen there.
Absolutely. And again, Ukraine comes up a lot in these conversations, in and out, before and after the elections. Perhaps just check in with Thea. Do you think the election results could shape the EU's role in mediating and supporting the peace negotiations? And perhaps a little bit more about the reconstruction efforts in Ukraine, as this is obviously a big part of what we have been discussing here at FTI the last weeks and months.
And I think that last point is really, it almost ties into what Hans is talking about the ability to get the munitions to where they need to go. I think there's a very big conversation that's been happening both in Europe, but also at G7 level, about how do we make sure that the funds that are needed actually make it to Ukraine in a feasible manner. And we see that I think that conversation in itself is going to be a top conversation still also for this current parliament. Not only because we're going to be looking at, how close is Ukraine going to be to the European Union, but also because something like the conversation about the EIB investments and how they can actually also contribute to this. I think this current parliament, it's a parliament that I would read as something that supporting Ukraine. We have some outlier elects who have a little bit of a different stance to that, but I think fundamentally we will see a reinvigoration of that call of support to friends like Ukraine of the European project. And I think there's also a lot of, and again, coming back to a lot of the initiatives that is about the strong stance and the strong, secure economy of Europe is also about how do we leverage that capital that we already have in order to use it for those either reconstruction projects or other kind of things that align the economic and the geopolitical power that Europe wants to play. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting aspects from that upcoming parliament about how are they going to make their influence heard. For me, I think Ukraine in itself is probably going to be a key topic because of the multitude of issues that surrounds the war and the way that Europe has played its role vis-a-vis this. And I would be very surprised if we don't see, there's a lot of new parliamentarians that are joining the European Parliament who haven't been part of the conversation so far. I'd be very surprised if we don't see some of them take quite a supportive and quite clear stance on this. about the mediation and the supporting the peace negotiations, I think that also is very much about what kind of role are we going to see a future top jobs group play? Are we going to see presidents who are going to be interacting with Ukraine and trying to drive some of those processes forward? But I think also from a very practical perspective, how to find the funds is also going to be a determining factor. So as we know, that is one of the powers that the European Parliament is always interested in having a vocal stance on, be it taxation or budgets or other things. That's usually something that takes a lot of attention. And again, with the configuration that we're starting to see, I would imagine a strong parliament voice on this.
Thanks so much, Thea. And another topic that came up just as discussing geopolitics as well, and if I can indulge just a little bit more, but when we're talking about EU's relations, and we already talked a little bit about the global influence that we have behind the economic power, but I think a lot of our attendees today would be really interested. What do you think the election results mean for EU's relations with the other major global powers, such as the US, with China, with Russia? What do you think we can take away from the direction of travel at the moment and speculate perhaps where this might be going? But equally, especially on the US side, what do we think with the upcoming presidential election, what that relationship could look like?
That's a very interesting one. I actually think that the EU elections are not going to be determinative for the relationship with the US, but the US elections themselves are going to be determinative for the relationship of the EU with the US. Which there is some nuance to that. Obviously, there's a big difference between Trump and Biden in many respects. But if we look at some of the key economic relationships between the US and the EU, actually Biden has not been overly helpful to the EU. The aluminum and steel tariffs are still not sorted. The IRA was a big discussion, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the ability for European companies to participate in that. It became clear that the US simply forgot to include the EU, and that wasn't even a conscious boxing out of the EU. It was just simply it wasn't on the mind of the US lawmakers that were drafting the Inflation Reduction Act, and that was under Biden, right? So I think if we look pure at the policies, forgetting all of the probably theater that we can expect from one of the presidential candidates in the US, it's not going to be the easiest relationship going forward. What really made a difference with the Biden administration is, of course, the very close and joined up approach towards Ukraine, with sanctions, with support to Ukraine, and that's where von der Leyen actually got in trouble with some of the EU member states for being too close to the US and being too much in the camp of Biden. And she mostly got pushback from that from, for example, the French. So what could happen in the EU-US relationship? My sentiment is that if Trump would win, that Europe would freak out a bit and therefore be more open to the East. And I wouldn't say that it would necessarily drop all of the trade protection discussions and the de-risking discussion with China, but I think Europe would be more hesitant to be tougher on China if Trump would win, whereas if Biden would win, I think there would be a sense of relief across Europe, and it would be closer alignment with the US, and therefore a tougher approach to China. So in a way, I think that election is going to be more important for that relationship. But we shouldn't forget that even the current mandate, and I certainly think that sentiment is not going to decrease. Just today, the EU announced tariffs on electric vehicles imports in the EU of 38%, much higher than some people were expecting, of 25% tariff. So even in the current setting, with the previous commission, if you will, there was already a much tougher stand on China. With this parliament coming in with more nationalist sentiments there, and the agenda as we described a bit, I think that relationship is going to remain quite fraught, and we can expect a reaction from China on the announcement today. More investigations have been opened on wind and others, so I think that relationship will remain challenging. But I think the US elections will actually determine how tough we are going to be towards China, and also how the relationship with the US is going to be.
Thanks, Hans. So we see a lot of interconnectedness there, and a lot of pieces depending one on the another. So here I take a quick pause, and I think again, just would like to remind folks on the call that we'll have a Q&A at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll pick up towards the end of our webinar. But equally, if you have more geopolitics questions, feel free to ask those as well. But for now, I think we'd like to delve into digital and tech, the other side of the dual green and digital transition. And here, what we've been hearing, and we've been telling people that the next commission may likely focus on implementation of all of the ambitious things that we've been talking about for the last 5 years. We may not be expecting any major announcements in the digital tech and space. I think TBC on that, but let's say perhaps that might be the case. What do you think is the role of technology and innovation in the future, though? And we definitely see that as a big part of the conversation when we're talking about boosting European competitiveness, which is undoubtedly going to be a major part of the conversation going forward. What is your assessment on that? Where do you think we might be going?
I think you're touching on two very important points here, Marija, because I think we have seen, looking backwards, we've seen quite a lot of activity, a lot of new packages that have been kind of passed throughout the last 5 years. I think what we should probably look to is that this is going to be more of a shift to implementation of a lot of those rules that needs to still be integrated into the European rule book. One thing is adopting the packages here in Brussels. Another thing is to see them actually come to fruition and start to have effect. So rather that than more big, massive packages and a lot of additional rules, I think is what we're going to see in the coming years. You're right, competitiveness is going to play a major role, because I think as we're looking at the dual transition, both green and technology transition, innovation is going to be a key driver, integrating technology and digitization into existing industries to make them more competitive, to make them stronger on the global market. I think given that it's an integrated part of the way that we all lead our lives, and that products that people are expecting to get are, let's say, tech and digital ready, I think we'll see a lot of that kind of almost integrating or seeping through everything that we're seeing when it comes to the competitiveness agenda, and therefore also into industrial policy, into any kind of sector legislation, into the different kind of initiatives that are coming. I think it would be hard to imagine that Europe would consider itself completely competitive on a global market in an analog way. I think that is, and there's a lot of new technologies that have some really interesting perspectives and abilities that I think we haven't even started seeing European businesses reap the benefits of, and that from AI to blockchain or distributed ledger technologies in general, there's a lot of different things that, and we have had in the last commission, I think even further now as well, we will have a focus on European champions. And again, looking to the European Parliament, I'd almost expect this Parliament to be even more supportive of that agenda compared to the last configuration, because we are seeing that kind of center-right focus with a very strong push. Somewhat also of a stop and take pause, instead of necessarily kind of letting, we always say that in Brussels, policy is king, or politics is king. I think it's a really good opportunity and a really good window for that reflection exercise that has been started with the Draghi report, with the letter report on CMU things, but also just generally, if we're looking at the strategic priorities, that reconfiguration of focus centered around the European industry and the European economy. So for me, it all kind of ties in, but personally, I see digital as a very strong driver still, but more in an integrated than a flagship manner.
Thanks so much, Thea. Absolutely makes sense. One more question, and maybe circling back to something that we mentioned earlier on our webinar, and we've touched upon healthcare, which is obviously a big part of our conversations and our lives for the last 5 years. But just thinking ahead, what role do you think healthcare is going to play the next 5 years? What do we expect for this particular policy area?
Right. No, it's hard to imagine that the previous commission started with a corona crisis, which completely upended the entire program that the new online commission had planned. Right. So, who knows what's happening in this in this mandate? We always think that the plans, as the strategies as designed, will roll out, but last time that turned out not to be the case either because of corona. And corona necessitated European action, I would say. So yeah, there were some ambitious proposals put forward, and I actually have to say that I think this commission has done a really great job on ensuring that enough vaccines came to Europeans, also to the smaller countries. Coordinating that was, I think, a massive feat, and there were things necessary like setting up the Health Emergency Agency HERA. That said, I think as that priority and pressure on dealing with the crisis has decreased, I think a lot of member states are looking again at healthcare being quite national. But I think certain elements are on the table and will still be discussed. So to answer your question quickly, I don't think there's going to be a massive amount of new legislation on healthcare because member states are quite sensitive about the national focus. But I think where Europeans can compete, there's still the health data space discussion where research can be aided by more joined up access to data. The common procurement instrument has been introduced and actually offers benefits to most of the EU countries. So I think healthcare will remain an area that the EU will be active on, but with far less priority given naturally because the corona crisis has receded, right? And then you tend to see that member states, especially with more nationalistic tendencies in member states, sort of retrench to hands off. This is not in the treaty. This is mine. It's for us to solve our healthcare problems. But I think the corona crisis and the decisions taken at European level have shown that there is certainly space for more European coordination to be more effective against certain external shocks.
Thank you, Hans. And as we are heading towards the end of our time together, one final question from me. And we did promise our friends and colleagues to touch upon businesses with presence in Europe, international businesses. One question I have to leave with you for our Q&A before we move to the Q&A, in fact, I would just like to ask you for what you want to leave our audience with, a piece of advice that you'd like to bring to the table. Obviously, FTI, we're in the business of advising, so I'm sure we have quite a few. Just passing on to you, you have about 1 minute. So there you go.
Thea, you want to kick off?
Sure. So I think one of the things that is a massive opportunity right now is that if you have that many new people in town, there's a contrary to what people might think, we don't necessarily elect the specialists for the committees and the other places where they're going to sit in European Parliament. So people will have there's going to be a lot of people in town who are very new and very interested in topics, very interested in knowledge. So I think it's for me, my one piece of advice is reach out and offer up your information and your knowledge and your insight into industry to the people that are going to be working on these issues going forward. As we just discussed, this is going to be probably a much more industry and strengthening the economy focused period. So make sure that you make yourself a reasonably constructive conversation partner for the people who are seeking that information. Get engaged. Come to Brussels.
I could add to that, and I do want to make come back to some of the dynamics because we have the EP elections, and that's actually the first step in musical chairs, as you said, right? So now comes the formation of the new European Commission. Also, the heads of state need to choose their own president. Jean-Michel's mandate is also coming to an end. Even the NATO Secretary General position could still be wrapped up in that. So there's a lot of who gets which position type of discussion going on. But actually, a lot of the policies will still need to be defined, right? I think the European Commission would have every DG has their own playbook of what they would like to see happen. So if you come in as a commissioner responsible for a certain area, there will definitely be suggestions made to that commissioner, but they have to survive a hearing in the European Parliament where they lay out their plans. And there's going to be some restructuring of the European Commission and the various DGs, no doubt, because that happens every round as well. So a lot of the details of what we can expect the next 5 years are still to shake out. The analysis we give today is based on, indeed, the outcomes of the elections in the European Parliament and some of the shifts in focus that we've clearly seen in the manifestos and the discussion so far. So that's one point I want to make. The second point is the national changes are going to be much more impactful possibly than some of the European Parliament changes, because at an aggregated EU level, there is a shift in the Parliament, no doubt, we discussed that, but it's not dramatic as some people would have feared, right? And also because on the right, not all the parties will actually form one big group that has a massive sway in the Parliament. But at a national level, I can see really big changes coming. France is, of course, with the European. It's quite amazing if you think about it. The French president disbanded the national parliament based on a European Parliament election, and that's that would lead to some big changes in France. In several other countries, you've seen big changes as well, and you've seen leaders like Tusk and Meloni actually bolstered by the European outcome, so they will feel more strong in the European Council discussion. So if we think about how decisions are made in Europe, which is a whole bunch of people weighing in on decisions. It's not just the European Parliament where there's indeed 56% new MEPs that are going to be really interested in the policy areas that they will be responsible for. There's also going to be a lot of change at member state level and in the council, and thus feeding into the European Commission. So a lot of this will shake out. And indeed, I agree that it's important to weigh into those discussions early rather than wait for proposals by the Commission that you then are shocked by or unpleasantly surprised. That said, I did see that there were some other questions, right?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Hans. And thank you to those who have put some questions in the Q&A. But in the meantime, those who have not had the chance, absolutely still time to do so. And I think we'll kick off with a financial services question because it's dealer's choice, and I am a bit of a nerd. So should we kick off maybe with Gabriel Graber's question from DWS, asking what are the important changes for financial institutions coming up, implications on CMU and BFI, etc. Our favorite abbreviations, and I think I know who loves to pick up on that, passing on to Thea.
Yeah, well, welcome to the alphabet soup, right? There's no European policy without it. So I think when it comes to the Capital Markets Union, we've seen quite a lot of tie-in from that agenda to the competitiveness agenda. So I think what we're going to see is that it's definitely an increased focus on, I think we've seen that before. The securitization agenda was big earlier on. We're still not seeing a market that is as vivid as it could be. So I think that is one of the places where we expect to see quite a further kind of development. We also expect to see something about supervisory convergence and regulatory burden. I think it depends on who you ask if we're going to be talking about ESA power, so European Supervisory Authority power, or if it's a matter of looking at reporting requirements and other things to make it more feasible. We've also seen, to a certain extent, we're seeing older topics pop up again, harmonization or further integration of the insolvency proceedings, just generally in improving some of those taxation accounting rules. So some of the things that are around the financial institutions as a whole. But we also have seen better development of equity investment conditions, something about, we've seen already some things about the listing conditions in Europe, but we're expecting to see more of those topics actually pop up. I would not be surprised if we see quite a big update on some of the things that Letta discussed in his report, about public investment, about making sure that we have, just from a general perspective, a limitation or a little bit of a burden on the capital outflow. So keeping the European investment capital within European markets, within European businesses. I think on the NBFI side, for me, that's a little bit of the other side of the coin, or they go very much hand in hand, looking into if the more kind of prudential frameworks should be extended to the NBFI space, the former shadow banking space. I think that discussion is not only in Europe, but just generally across a lot of international institutions. That is still getting discussed, and I think that goes to the economic security, that goes to making sure that we have a strong and resilient European economic system. So that for me is something that we'll see more. Then of course, and I come back to digital, I would be remiss if I don't mention it here as well. I think digital is going to be a fundamental integration, almost a vertical, throughout the financial services, the capital markets agenda and discussions, to be fair, because it is one of the big enablers that I think we can see more benefits getting reaped from for the sector. That was a very long way of saying a lot of things are going to happen, but it is a top priority. We've seen it across the board, also in what we're seeing that's going to go into the strategic agenda for the European Council discussions. When CMU was mentioned at that level, we hopefully see some shifts in the next 5 years.
Thanks, Thea, and thanks, Gabriel, for indulging us. I think we were waiting for that opportunity. Just looking at the Q&A as well, and we have a question exactly on a couple of priorities and agenda setting from Nick Prebil, who's asking, is there more information regarding the agenda and content of the formal meeting coming up on the 17th? So very much finger on the pulse there. Do we have any information?
A bit, right? It's an informal meeting, so it's clearly a meeting where they don't necessarily expect decisions yet, because then it has to be a formal meeting. But it's a meeting that has been introduced to indeed have a first discussion around the outcomes of the European Parliament elections and what that means for especially the nomination by the heads of state on who should be Commission President. And interestingly, just a bit of Brussels gossip here, that there's apparently a bit of a discussion going on about whether Ursula von der Leyen should be invited to that European Council meeting, which typically is the case. The President of the European Commission is always there. The President of the Parliament is often there at the beginning as well. But of course, if you're going to talk about that job, Jean Michel had proposed to not have her in that discussion. So that's an interesting one. That's going to be part of it. The second is that there's a big expectation that the Draghi report might be discussed there as well, because Mario Draghi has been asked by the European Commission to come up with that competitiveness report. And I think we expect that report to be presented in that meeting and discussed in that meeting as well.
Thanks so much, Hans. So for another question that we're moving away from FS, the comfortable place of numbers and alphabet soup, to energy. And we have Pascal Charuti asking us, what comes up with energy transition, considering the latest EU votes? Where do we think this is heading?
That's an interesting one, because the Green Deal we discussed, right, with which of course has important implications for where the energy has to come from. But I would imagine with energy transition itself, you also want to be a bit more specific about energy sources and that sort of thing. I think the two are linked though. So if you're going to put a bit of a break on some of the Green Deal policies, I think it's going to be hard to transition as much as we can. On the other hand, if you're more inward facing, if you will, and you find national sovereignty very important, you do want to make sure that you're not dependent on external sources of energy. So how those two balance out is a bit hard to say, but I would imagine that work to further integrate the EU energy market and the energy grids would continue in the new mandate, because, for example, there's more wind in the north and more sun in the south. So yeah, even if you want more renewables, you need to connect the grids to make that possible. So I think energy transition, it might not go as fast as the plans are at the moment, because freeing up funding at the EU level to fund it is going to be more difficult with more nationalist government that want to see less money flowing to the EU, frankly. On the other hand, the security aspects of it might be a positive for the energy transition. So it might balance out between those two. But hard to say.
Thanks so much, Hans. Another one, a wait and see, but absolutely fair. So today we're just gearing towards the very end of our hour together, and we want to be very timely and not to steal too much of your precious time. I would like to thank our panelists, Hans and Thea, for speaking to us today. And thank you very much for all of the attendees for joining us today. We had quite a number of you today, and we're very happy to host you. Thank you so much. I think one thing before we close off, I would like to pass on to my colleague Dafni just to close up with a couple of pieces from FTI.
Thank you all for the interesting discussion and questions. Just on our side, to let you know that we remain available to answer any questions that you may have. As we mentioned, the results are not final at all yet, and the interesting period is starting now with all the appointment of top jobs, the circulation of mission letters, strategic agendas, and the EU leaders meetings that we just discussed. So stay tuned for more, and feel free to reach out with more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Indeed.
Thank you from me, Hans and Thea. Thank you for joining. We'll see you at the next one, and we release you onto your next meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.